The lamp had been burning in the east window of the Blackwell ranch house every single night for 6 years, and on the night Dorothy Crawford's wagon wheel cracked clean in half on the Cimarron Road, that small orange flame was the only light for 30 miles in any direction. It was the autumn of 1882, and the Oklahoma Territory was the kind of dark that could swallow a person whole if they let it. Dorothy had been traveling since before dawn, pushing her 2 horses harder than was kind because she had no other choice. She had left Dodge City 4 days prior with everything she owned packed into a single covered wagon, 2 trunks of clothing, a sewing kit, a worn Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, a cast iron skillet, and a small tin box containing $47.30, which was every dollar she had left in the world after paying off her late husband's debts. She was 31 years old, alone, and moving south toward a teaching position that a schoolmaster named Hargrove had offered her by letter in the small settlement of Caldwell Junction. She had been told the road was manageable. She had been told wrong. The wheel gave out somewhere between the 3rd and 4th Creek crossing, and the sound it made was like a rifle crack in the quiet dark. The wagon lurched sideways so hard that Dorothy was nearly thrown from the bench seat, and she had to grab the iron footrest with both hands to keep herself upright. Her horses, a pair of dusty brown mares she had named Pepper and Salt when she bought them from a trader outside of Wichita, danced and pulled against their harnesses with the whites of their eyes showing in the moonlight. Dorothy climbed down carefully, her boots finding the muddy road, and she walked around the wagon with a lantern she lit from her tinderbox. The right rear wheel had shattered almost perfectly at the axle point. 3 of the wooden spokes snapped outward like broken fingers. She stood looking at it for a long moment, the lantern swinging gently from her hand, and she did not cry. She had done all her crying in Dodge City, standing at a grave marker that read Thomas Crawford, 1847–1881, good man, and she had made herself a promise that day that she would not spend the rest of her life weeping over things she could not change. So she did not cry now. She simply looked at the broken wheel, then looked out at the darkness of the plains around her, and then she looked east. There was a light. It was very small and very far, but it was unmistakably a light warm and steady in what she now realized was a window, sitting on a low rise perhaps a mile off the road. She unhitched Pepper from the wagon, leaving Salt tethered to the broken rig with enough rope to move comfortably and enough water in a bucket to last the night. Then she swung herself up bareback onto Pepper and rode toward the light. The ride took 20 minutes across rough ground that smelled of sage and dry grass, and as she drew closer, the light resolved itself into the shape of a window, a proper glass window set into the side of a large, well-built ranch house with a wide porch and a dark barn behind it. There was a lamp burning inside that window, a plain oil lamp with a clear glass chimney, and it burned with the steady, patient kind of light that does not flicker. Dorothy rode up to the porch steps and called out before dismounting, because she had not survived 31 years of frontier life without learning that you announce yourself to a ranch house in the dark unless you want to get shot at. "Hello, the house," she called. "I have a broken wagon on the Cimarron Road and I am asking for help. My name is Dorothy Crawford. I mean no trouble." For a long moment there was nothing, and then a light moved somewhere inside the house, and then the front door opened, and a man stood in the doorway holding a rifle in one hand and a lantern in the other. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that makes a doorframe look proportionate, with broad shoulders and dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same cedar the Plains ranchers used for fence posts. He was wearing a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the autumn chill, and he looked at her with dark eyes that were careful and direct. "You said Crawford?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried. "Dorothy Crawford. My wagon wheel is shattered on the road about a mile west by northwest. I have 1 horse still tethered to it. I can pay for help." He looked at her for another moment, then leaned the rifle against the inside of the doorframe and stepped out onto the porch. "Eli Blackwell," he said, "you do not need to pay. Let me get my boots." He was back in 2 minutes wearing boots and a canvas coat, and he had a second lantern lit. He came down the porch steps and led a large gray gelding out of the barn with the practiced ease of a man who could do it in the dark without thinking. And Dorothy noticed he had not asked her a single unnecessary question. He had not asked her why she was traveling alone or where she was going or whether her husband knew she was out at this hour. He had simply gotten his horse. They rode back to the wagon together without much talk, and when they arrived, Eli walked around the broken wheel with his lantern held low, crouching to look at the axle, pressing his thumb against the cracked wood with a professional kind of attention. "Wheel is done," he said. "Axle is fine. I have a spare wheel at the ranch. Might need a bit of work to fit right, but I can have it on by morning if you want." "I would be grateful," Dorothy said. She was untying Salt from the wagon as she spoke, checking the mare's legs and face with practiced hands. Salt was fine, just nervous, and she nuzzled Dorothy's shoulder in the way she always did when she wanted reassurance. "You can stay the house tonight," Eli said. It was not an offer made with any kind of presumption. It was the flat, practical hospitality of a man who had been raised in a place where you did not turn a person away from a warm house in the dark. "I have 2 boys. They are asleep now. My housekeeper, Mrs. Totham, sleeps in the back room. It is proper." "Thank you," Dorothy said, and she meant it more than the 2 words could carry. They rode back to the ranch with Salt and the gray gelding walking side by side, and Dorothy looked at the window with its lamp as they approached, and she thought that it was a good light, that it was the kind of light that looked like it had been burning for a long time, steady and warm and unconcerned with the dark around it. The inside of the Blackwell ranch house was plain but well kept. The front room had a stone fireplace, 2 good chairs, a heavy oak table, and walls hung with a few simple things. A calendar from a Dodge City merchant, a child's drawing tacked near the window, and a framed photograph of a woman that Dorothy did not look at for long, because she recognized the particular weight photographs like that carried. There was a rag rug on the floor that had been worn soft with use, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular honest smell of a house where people actually lived. Mrs. Totham appeared from the back of the house in her nightdress and a shawl, a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and white hair pinned back. She looked at Dorothy the way experienced women look at other women who arrive unexpected at ranch houses in the middle of the night, which is to say, she looked at her honestly and without judgment, and she must have decided quickly that Dorothy was not trouble because she said, "I will put the kettle on," and disappeared into the kitchen. Eli showed Dorothy to the small room at the front of the house that seemed to serve as a sitting room and study both, and he brought in a blanket and a pillow from a cedar chest in the hall. "The boys will be up before sunrise," he said. "They are loud, but they mean well." "How old are they?" Dorothy asked, settling into the chair by the window. "Thomas is 9. Henry is 7. He said the names without any particular expression, but Dorothy noticed that the name Thomas came out just slightly different from Henry, not softer exactly, but with a kind of careful precision as if he had taught himself to say it normally and was still practicing. She wondered if he knew someone else named Thomas, or if he had known someone named Thomas who was gone. She did not ask. It was not her business. She was a stranger in his house at midnight, and she had manners. Mrs. Totham brought tea and a plate of cold biscuits with butter, and Dorothy ate and drank by the window while Eli sat across from her and told her about the road conditions south toward Caldwell Junction, which she had mentioned as her destination. He knew the road well. He had cattle leased on pasture south of there, and he drove them north twice a year. He told her which creek crossings were reliable at this time of year, and which ones could run deep after rain, and which stretch of the road had loose shale that was hard on wagon wheels, which was relevant information given her recent experience. He was a good talker when he had something useful to say, Dorothy decided. He did not talk for the sake of hearing himself, but when he talked, it was worth listening to. She found herself watching his hands while he spoke, large, calloused hands that rested on his knees or gestured occasionally to indicate north or south or the bend of a particular creek. And they were steady hands, the kind that belonged to a man who was comfortable with himself and his work. She asked him how long he had been on this land, and he said 12 years since 1870, when he had come up from Texas with $50 and a string of horses. He had built the ranch house himself, him and 2 hired men, and he had built it to last, which it clearly had. Dorothy told him about her teaching position in Caldwell Junction and about Thomas Crawford, briefly and without excessive detail. That he had been a good man, that he had died of a fever the previous winter, that she had spent the spring and summer settling the estate and paying what was owed, and that Caldwell Junction offered a fresh start. She said all of this in a clear, even voice and watched Eli's face while she said it, and he listened the same way he did everything else, fully, without interrupting, without offering unnecessary sympathy or clumsy condolences. What he said when she was done was, "That is a hard year." "Yes," she said, "it was." And somehow that simple exchange was more comforting than anything more elaborate would have been. She slept a few hours in the chair, wrapped in the blanket, and woke to the sound of small feet on wooden floors and the smell of coffee and frying salt pork. The lamp in the east window had burned down to its last half-inch of oil but was still burning. She noticed still burning, as if it refused to go out. Thomas Blackwell was 9 years old and had his father's dark eyes and a gap in his front teeth that made his grin look slightly roguish, and he came into the sitting room at dawn without knocking and stopped dead when he saw Dorothy, then recovered quickly and said, with great dignity, "Good morning, ma'am." Henry was 7 and smaller, with lighter hair and his father's serious expression, and he came in behind his brother and said nothing at all, just stared at Dorothy with wide, assessing eyes. "Good morning," Dorothy said to both of them. "I am Dorothy Crawford. My wagon wheel broke last night and your father is helping me fix it." Thomas accepted this immediately and sat down on the floor near the fireplace with the ease of a boy who was comfortable in his own house. Henry continued to stare for another full minute, then apparently reached some internal conclusion, walked over to Dorothy's chair, and held out a small piece of carved wood that turned out on examination to be a horse. "I made it," he said. "It is very fine," Dorothy told him honestly, because the proportions were good, the legs were graceful, and someone had taught this boy to whittle with real attention. "Did your father teach you?" Henry nodded. "He is good at it," Thomas offered from across the room. "Pa can make anything out of wood. He made the whole fence around the south pasture last spring." "The whole fence?" Dorothy said, impressed. 200 posts, Thomas said, with the proprietary pride of a boy talking about his father's achievements. "Took him 6 weeks. Eli himself appeared in the doorway then, already in his coat with sawdust on his hands, and he looked at his boys with the particular expression of a man who has learned to absorb the constant noise and energy of children into his daily life like weather, not fighting it, not ignoring it, simply being present in it. "Come eat," he told them, and to Dorothy, "Wheel is done. I will have it on the wagon before you finish breakfast." Breakfast was Mrs. Toddam's salt pork and biscuits and strong black coffee, and Dorothy sat at the oak table with both boys and the housekeeper while Eli worked outside. Thomas talked nearly continuously about the horses in the barn, about a coyote he had seen near the South Creek, about a boy at school in Caldwell Junction who had told him that Oklahoma Territory was going to become a proper state soon, which Thomas found both exciting and suspicious in equal measure. Henry ate methodically and said very little, but twice he looked at Dorothy with those serious, assessing eyes, and twice she smiled at him, and after the second time he almost smiled back. She found herself thinking, while she listened to Thomas rattle on, that these were well-raised boys. There was a quality to them, a directness, a fundamental steadiness that she recognized as the result of good parenting, and the parenting here, it was clear, was mostly Eli's. She did not know the whole story of their mother. She had seen the photograph on the wall, a young woman with light hair and a formal expression, the way people looked in photographs because photographers told them to hold still. But she understood that the woman was gone, had been gone for some time, and that Eli Blackwell had raised these two boys alone on a working cattle ranch, and he had raised them well. She felt something she had not expected to feel that morning, sitting in a stranger's kitchen in the Oklahoma Territory with sawdust on her boots and her wagon half repaired outside. She felt interested. Not romantically. Not yet. It was too soon and she was too practical a woman for that. But genuinely, honestly interested in this man and his life and his children and his well-run house and the lamp he kept burning in his east window. She asked Mrs. Totham about the lamp while Eli was still outside, half expecting the housekeeper to give her a simple answer about safety or signaling, but Mrs. Totham's expression shifted slightly when she asked, not dramatically, just a faint softening around the eyes, and she said, "For safety, Mr. Blackwell says, in case someone gets lost in the dark on the road." And then she refilled Dorothy's coffee and changed the subject. Dorothy filed that away in the part of her mind where she kept things that were not entirely what they appeared to be. Eli had the wheel on before she finished her second cup of coffee, and when she came outside to check it, she found him lying in the dirt beside the wagon with his head under the axle housing, making some adjustment she could not see. He came out when he heard her boots on the porch steps, stood up and wiped his hands on his canvas coat. "Should hold all the way to Caldwell Junction," he said. "Do not take the shallow ford at Whiskey Creek. Go upstream about 300 yards to where the bank is graveled, the bottom is firmer." "I will," she said. She paused, then said, "Can I ask you something that is none of my business?" He looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "You can ask." "The lamp in your east window," she said. "Mrs. Totham says it is for safety, but I saw it from a mile off the road, and it has been burning for as long as she seemed comfortable saying." Eli was quiet for a moment. "A crow called somewhere out on the plains once and then was silent. 6 years, he said finally, his voice even and without particular emotion. "I have kept it burning 6 years." "That is a long time," Dorothy said, and she said it gently without pressing. He looked at her steadily, and there was something behind his eyes that was neither grief nor anger, exactly something older and quieter than either of those things. "My wife," he said. "She left in the fall of 1876, not died. Left. She wanted to go back east to her family. I let her go because it was the right thing to do and because she was unhappy here and I could not fix that." He stopped, looked away toward the horizon. "The boys do not really understand it. Thomas was 3. Henry was 1. I kept the lamp so that if she ever came back she would see a light and know she was welcome." He paused. "The boys think it is for safety, for travelers on the road. I let them think that." Dorothy stood very still and listened to the quiet after he finished speaking, and she thought about what it took to keep a lamp burning in a window for 6 years for a woman who had left and might never come back. She thought about what kind of man did that, not in bitterness, not in obsession, but in simple, patient faithfulness. She thought it was either the most devoted thing she had ever heard of or the saddest, and she was not sure the two things were different. "That is a faithful thing to do," she said carefully. "It might be foolish," he said. "Maybe both," she said. He looked at her, and something shifted just slightly in his expression, not much, just a fraction of an opening, like a door with a good seal that moves slightly in a change of wind. Then it was gone, and he was checking the wheel again, running his thumb along the new spoke joins with his usual professional attention. Dorothy loaded her trunks back into the wagon with help from Thomas, who insisted on carrying the heavy one and managed it with considerable effort and great dignity. She shook Mrs. Totham's hand. She said goodbye to Henry, who had followed her out to the wagon at a slight distance, and who, when she turned to him, held out the little carved wooden horse again. "You should keep it," she told him. "I can make another," he said seriously. "Pa has more wood." Dorothy took the horse and tucked it into her coat pocket where she could feel the smooth weight of it, and she climbed up onto the wagon seat and took the reins, and she looked down at Eli Blackwell standing by his porch steps with the morning light on his face. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwell," she said. "I am not sure what would have happened without your light." "Safe travel, Mrs. Crawford," he said. She drove south toward Caldwell Junction, and she did not look back, because she had learned that looking back only made the going harder. But she kept Henry's little carved horse in her coat pocket, and she thought about the lamp in the east window, and she thought about a man who kept faith with someone who had left him, and she found that she could not stop thinking about it for most of the 3-hour drive that remained. Caldwell Junction in the fall of 1882 was a town that was trying very hard to be more than it was. It had a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a church, a saloon, a barber shop, and a small whitewashed schoolhouse at the eastern end of town that smelled of chalk dust and pine resin, and the particular earnest industriousness of a place where children were expected to learn things. The town also had a hotel, which is where Dorothy stayed while she found her footing, and a post office, which is where she went first thing on the morning of her second day to send a letter to her sister in Missouri letting her know she had arrived safely. She met the schoolmaster Hargrove, who turned out to be a slight, nervous man in his 40s who talked too fast and deferred to her opinion on every question about teaching methodology in a way that suggested he was somewhat relieved to have someone else take responsibility for the schoolhouse. She met the Reverend Mac Neal, a broad-shouldered Scotsman who shook her hand with genuine warmth and told her she was welcome in his congregation. She met the woman who ran the general store, a Mrs. Aldridge who was the most efficient person Dorothy had encountered in some years. A woman who could tell you the price of a pound of coffee, the date of the next cattle drive-through, and the character of every person in town all in the same breath, and who was right about most of it. She began teaching on a Monday, 2 weeks after her arrival, with 17 children between the ages of 6 and 14 crammed into the little schoolhouse. She loved it immediately. She had always been good at finding the precise way to explain a thing that made it make sense to a particular child, good at holding a room's attention without force, good at making children feel that what they were learning mattered. The work filled her days with purpose and filled her evenings with enough fatigue that she slept well, which was a mercy, because when she did not sleep well she thought too much. She thought about Eli Blackwell anyway. Not obsessively, but persistently. The way you think about a piece of music you heard briefly and cannot quite get out of your head. She thought about his hands and the way he had lain in the dirt under her wagon without making anything of it. She thought about what he had told her about the lamp, and she thought about his 2 boys, and she thought about the fact that he had given her a full hour of his time and a spare wagon wheel without accepting a cent for any of it. 3 weeks after she arrived in Caldwell Junction, Eli Blackwell rode into town. She saw him first from the schoolhouse window during the last half hour of the school day, when she was walking between the rows of desks and checking her students' arithmetic. He was riding the gray gelding, and he had Thomas with him on a smaller bay horse, and they were headed toward the general store. Dorothy watched them for a moment, then returned her attention to her students, and she felt something she recognized as complicated, a kind of alertness that was warm and slightly uncomfortable at the same time, like touching something you have been thinking about for weeks and finding it more real than you expected. She saw him at the general store when she went there after school to buy lamp oil and flour. He was at the counter talking to Mrs. Aldridge about a hardware order, and Thomas was examining a display of penny candies with the intensity of a professional. Eli turned when she came through the door and something crossed his face, a brief, genuine surprise, and then a kind of relief that she was not sure he intended to show. "Mrs. Crawford," he said. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. "Are you in town for supplies?" "Hardware and a few things." Thomas wanted to come. He glanced at his son, who had apparently decided that the penny candies required his complete and undivided attention. He has wanted to come every time I ride in since you came through. I believe he is hoping to see you. Dorothy looked at Thomas, who was very carefully not looking at either of them, and she said, "Thomas." He turned around with the magnificent casualness of a 9-year-old who has been caught and grinned his gap-toothed grin. "Hello, Mrs. Crawford. How is Henry?" she asked. "He made 4 more horses," Thomas reported. "He is running out of wood again." "Tell him to make a donkey next," Dorothy said. "I would like a donkey." Thomas thought about this solemnly. "He probably can," he said. "Pa taught him good." Dorothy bought her lamp oil and her flour, and she and Eli walked out to the street at the same time, and they stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk while Thomas mounted his bay horse with the practiced ease of a rancher's son. "How is the teaching?" Eli asked. "Good," she said. "Better than good. I have 17 students and only 3 of them have decided they do not like me, and I expect I can change 2 of the 3. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not exactly a smile. It was closer to the thing that happens before a smile, the slight softening that is the honest precursor of it. "And the third?" he asked. "Stubborn case," she said. "His name is Merritt Aldridge, and he is 13 years old, and he has decided that book learning is beneath his dignity. I am working on it." "Give him something to build," Eli said. "Boys like Merritt Aldridge do not learn from books. They learn from making things." Dorothy looked at him. "That is good advice," she said. "I was a boy like Merritt Aldridge," he said. And this time the almost smile became something more definite, not big, but real. And it changed his face in a way that made it considerably warmer and more approachable. And Dorothy noticed this and thought about it later, walking back to her hotel room with her flour and her lamp oil. She followed his advice about Merritt Aldridge. The following Monday she gave the boy a practical problem. The schoolhouse front step was soft, she told him, and the board needed replacing. She asked him if he could look at it and tell her what would need to be done. Merritt Aldridge looked at the step with the concentrated seriousness of someone who has been handed a real problem for the first time. And by the following Friday, he had talked his father into giving him the wood and the nails, and he had replaced the step himself. And he was back in his seat with a new expression that was not exactly enthusiasm for book learning, but was at least the recognition that a person who could read could figure out how much wood he needed without guessing. Dorothy considered this a significant victory. Eli came to town twice more in the following month, and each time he stopped and spoke with her, and each time the conversation was a little longer and went a little further from polite exchange into something more like actual talk. The kind where you say what you actually think rather than what is expected, and where the other person hears it. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, on a farm that her father had carved out of ground that was never entirely willing to be farmland, and about the school she had attended in town, 3 miles away, that had shaped the direction of her life more than anything else. She told him about Thomas Crawford, not the grief of it, but the person of it, what kind of man he had been, which she thought was more respectful than mourning him in the abstract. She said he had been a good man who had worked hard and loved her honestly and been taken by a fever before he was 40, and she said it without self-pity, and without the kind of excessive composure that is just suppressed self-pity, and Eli listened to all of it the way he listened to everything she said, which was completely. He told her about coming up from Texas with $50 and those string of horses, about the early years on the ranch when he had lived on hard tack and determination for 2 full winters before the cattle operation turned a real profit. He told her about meeting his wife. Her name had been Eliza, he said, and she had been beautiful and restless, and the life out here had been a kind of slow starvation for her, not of food, but of everything she had grown up believing a life should contain. He said he did not blame her for leaving. He said it plainly and without apparent resentment, and Dorothy believed him, which made it sadder rather than less sad. "Do you still expect her to come back?" Dorothy asked him one November afternoon, standing outside the livery stable while he waited for Thomas to bring his horse out. There was a cold wind coming off the plains, and she had her coat pulled close, and she asked the question directly because she was a direct woman, and because she thought they had moved past the stage of the acquaintance where you stepped around important things. Eli was quiet for a long moment, looking at the middle distance. "I did for a long time," he said. 5 years, maybe. In the 6th year I stopped expecting it and started just keeping the lamp. He looked at her. "That is different. You understand the difference?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "The lamp is not about expecting anymore," he said. "It is about what kind of man I want to be, whether she comes back or not." He paused. "It is about the boys, too. I want them to grow up in a house where the light is always on, where there is always something burning in the window." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, at his face in the cold November light, and she thought that she was looking at a man who had gone through something that could have made him hard and closed and had come out the other side not soft exactly. He was not soft. She did not think he had a soft bone in his body, but open. Genuinely, carefully open. "That is a beautiful thing to say," she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way men do when they have said something true and emotional in public and are not entirely sure it was appropriate. He said, "Thomas is taking a long time with that horse." Dorothy laughed. It came out unexpectedly, genuine and warm, and Eli looked at her, and that almost smile was back, and this time it became a full smile, real and unhurried, and she thought it was possibly the best smile she had seen in years. Thomas eventually emerged with the horse, and a piece of wrapped candy he had apparently obtained somewhere during his extended errand. And Eli gave his son a look that communicated both awareness and tolerance in the economical way of a man who has learned that fighting every battle is not worth the cost. They rode north, and Dorothy went back to her hotel room, and she sat by her window watching the last light go off the plain, and she thought about a lamp burning in a window, and about a man who kept it burning not from hope anymore but from principle. And she felt something that she recognized with a kind of startled honesty as the beginning of love. She did not do anything about it immediately. She was a practical woman, and practical women did not do anything about the beginning of love immediately. They watched it and tested it, and gave it time to either develop into something real or reveal itself as the product of loneliness and proximity, which it sometimes was, and which was worth knowing before you acted on it. She had been alone for nearly 2 years. She had been a widow for most of those 2 years. It was possible, she acknowledged to herself, that she was simply responding to Eli Blackwell's steadiness and his good parenting and his lamp in the window because she was tired of being alone, and not because there was something actually real between them. But she did not entirely believe that, and she was honest enough to admit it. December came with a hard frost that turned the plains silver in the mornings and made the schoolhouse stove essential. Dorothy's students arrived bundled in coats and scarves and sat close to the stove and breathed steam, and she taught them long division and geography and how to parse a sentence. And she read to them on Friday afternoons from a book of adventure stories that she had brought from Missouri, and the whole school was very quiet on Friday afternoons, which she considered a significant achievement. She was invited to Christmas supper at the Reverend McNeil's house, along with most of the town, and she went and ate well and talked with the Aldridge's missus. Aldridge turned out to be excellent company in a social setting, opinionated and funny and precise, and she played a waltz on the Reverend's parlor piano because she had learned piano as a girl and had not forgotten it, and afterwards several people said complimentary things about her playing. She rode out to the Blackwell Ranch on the 23rd of December. She told herself on the way out that she was going because she had a gift for Henry, a small book on woodworking she had ordered through Mrs. Aldridge's general store, thinking of the boy's careful whittling, and that was true, she did have the book. But she also knew, with the particular self-awareness of a woman who had been examining her own motives carefully for 2 months, that she was going because she wanted to see Eli Blackwell, and she was tired of not going. The ranch was different in December. The plains were winter bare and the light was low and gray, but the ranch house had smoke coming from its chimney, and a wreath of dried grass and cedar on the front door that someone, she suspected Thomas, had assembled with more enthusiasm than precision. And in the east window, clear through the glass, the lamp was burning. Mrs. Totham let her in and made the same instant social calculation she had made in September, this time arriving at a warmer conclusion and putting the kettle on without being asked. Both boys appeared from somewhere in the house, Thomas running and Henry walking with his usual dignity, and Dorothy gave Henry the woodworking book, and the expression on his face was one of those moments that made her love children fiercely and completely. He held the book with both hands and read the title twice, then looked up at her with those serious dark eyes that were so much like his father's. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," he said, with the gravity of someone receiving something of real value. "You are very welcome, Henry," she said. Eli came in from outside, brushing snow off his coat. It had started to snow lightly on her ride out, and the world had gone soft and white, and he stopped when he saw her, and that fractional opening crossed his face again, whiter this time. "You came out in the snow," he said. "It is not much snow yet," she said. "It might be more by the time you want to ride back," he said. "Then I suppose I had better not stay too long," she said, and she met his eyes when she said it. He held her gaze for a moment, then said, "Stay for supper." It was the same direct, no-nonsense hospitality as before, but it was different too. There was something underneath it that had not been there in September. She stayed for supper. Mrs. Totham made a good beef stew with biscuits, and they sat around the oak table, Eli and Dorothy on one side, Thomas and Henry across from them, Mrs. Totham at the head, and they ate and talked. And Thomas told Dorothy about a bull they had taken on from a neighboring ranch that had an opinion about fencing, and Henry ate his stew steadily, and occasionally offered a single precise observation about something Thomas had said. And Eli watched his sons and talked when he had something to say and listened when he did not. And Dorothy sat beside him, and thought that this was a good table to sit at. After supper, Thomas and Henry were sent to do their evening chores, and Mrs. Totham announced she had letters to write and retired to her room with a discretion that Dorothy suspected was not entirely accidental, and Dorothy and Eli sat by the fire in the front room with cups of coffee and the comfortable quiet of people who have been talking for 2 months and have moved past the need to fill silence. After a while, Eli said, "I want to say something." "All right," Dorothy said. He looked at the fire for a moment, then looked at her. "I have not said this kind of thing to a person in a long time," he said. "So I am going to say it plainly, because plainly is the only way I know." He paused. "I think about you a good deal, Mrs. Crawford. I think about the things you say and the way you think about things, and I look forward to coming to town on Tuesdays more than I have looked forward to much of anything in some years, and I want to know if you think about me." Dorothy looked at him for a moment, at his face in the firelight, serious and careful and entirely honest. Then she said, "I rode out to your ranch in the snow on the 23rd of December, Mr. Blackwell. I think that answers your question." Something happened in his face, a slow, profound relaxing, as if he had been holding a tension so long he had forgotten it was tension, and now it was letting go. He said quietly, "Yes, I suppose it does." They talked for another hour, close by the fire with the snow coming down quietly outside, and what they talked about were things that mattered, what they wanted for their lives, what they had learned from the hard years, what they believed about how people should treat each other, and what a good life looked like. Dorothy talked about wanting permanence, not the false permanence of never changing, but the real kind, where you root yourself in something and you let it grow. Eli talked about the boys, about wanting them to have more than he had had, not in terms of money, but in terms of certainty, the deep settled certainty of a home that was always there. "The lamp," Dorothy said eventually, very quietly. He looked at her. "Have you decided about it?" she asked. "About Eliza?" Eli was quiet for a long time looking at the fire, then he said, "She is remarried. I got a letter last spring from her brother. She has been in Philadelphia since 1878. She has a new husband and a daughter." He paused. "I am glad for her. I mean that she deserved to be happy, and I think she is." "And the lamp," Dorothy said. He looked at her steadily. "The lamp stays," he said, "but what it means has changed." Dorothy looked back at him with equal steadiness. "What does it mean now?" she asked. "It means there is always a light here," he said, "for whoever needs it." He paused, then said more quietly, "For you, if you want it." Dorothy Crawford sat in Eli Blackwell's front room on the 23rd of December, 1882, with the snow coming down outside and the fire burning warm and the lamp burning steady in the east window, and she made the decision that she had been working toward since September, which is to say she made it fully and without reservation. "I want it," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand carefully, slowly, the way he did everything, with the particular gentleness of a large man who knows his own strength. And she let him, and they sat like that for a while with the fire burning and the snow falling and the lamp steady in the window. Thomas came back in from the barn 20 minutes later, stamped snow off his boots in the doorway, saw his father holding Mrs. Crawford's hand by the fire, and processed this information with the astonishing speed of a 9-year-old who has been hoping for something without quite admitting it to himself. He stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, then said, "I'm going to go tell Henry," and disappeared. Dorothy looked at Eli. Eli looked at Dorothy. He said, "I apologize." "Do not," she said, and laughed. Henry's reaction, relayed by Thomas approximately 4 minutes later, was apparently to say "oh" in a thoughtful tone and return to studying his new woodworking book. Thomas considered this insufficient and demanded that Henry come and look himself, and Henry came and looked, and his assessment was delivered in 3 words: "That is good." Then he went back to his book. The snow was too heavy to ride back to Caldwell Junction that night, and Dorothy stayed in the same front room she had slept in September, with the same blanket from the same cedar chest. But this time, before she settled in, she stood for a moment at the east window and looked at the lamp burning there. The same lamp, she supposed, or one very like it. And she thought about all the people who might have seen that light in 6 years, travelers and wanderers and lonely riders on a dark plain. And she thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who keeps a light burning not for recognition, but simply because the darkness is real, and a light is a good and honest answer to it. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window for a moment, beside the lamp. Then she went to her chair and slept better than she had in months. The courtship of Dorothy Crawford and Eli Blackwell was conducted, over the following 4 months, with the particular combination of practicality and warmth that suited both of them. He rode to town on Tuesdays and sometimes Saturdays. She rode out to the ranch on alternate Sundays after church, and ate lunch with the family at the oak table, and listened to Thomas's running commentary on ranch life, and helped Henry with the more complex sections of his woodworking book, and talked with Mrs. taught him in the kitchen about cooking and weather and the general nature of the world. The boys were part of this in an active way, which Dorothy thought was right and necessary. She was not simply entering into a relationship with Eli. She was entering, if things worked out, into a life that included Thomas and Henry, and she needed to know them and they needed to know her. She took this seriously. She thought about what it meant to be a constant presence in the life of children who had already experienced one person leaving, and she knew that the most important thing she could do was to be exactly what she was, honest and consistent and interested in them as actual people. Henry gave her more carved animals over the months. A donkey, as she had requested, then an ox, then a very fine horse that was better than the first one by some margin, and then in March, a small carved figure that it took her a moment to identify, and then she recognized it. It was a woman in a long dress, with her arms slightly raised, and the workmanship was considerably more ambitious than the animals. She looked at Henry when she saw it, and his serious face had a slight color in it. "Is this meant to be anyone in particular?" she asked carefully. "Yes," he said, and did not elaborate. She kept it on the windowsill of her hotel room next to the small carved horse from September, and she looked at them both when she sat at the window in the evenings, and she thought about what it meant that a 7-year-old boy had made her likeness out of wood and given it to her. In March, Eli asked her to marry him. He did it on a Sunday afternoon after lunch, with Thomas and Henry and Mrs. Totham all inside the house, and the two of them standing on the front porch in the cold March sunlight. He was very direct about it. He said he loved her. He said he believed she loved him. He said he thought they could build a good life together, and that he wanted very much to do that. And he asked her if she would marry him. He did not have a ring yet, he said, but he could get one from Caldwell Junction, and he wanted to ask before he bought one to make sure he was buying it for the right reasons and not wishful thinking. Dorothy thought this was possibly the most sensible proposal she had ever heard, which was consistent with the man who was making it, and she said yes. They were married in April, in the Reverend Mac Neal's church in Caldwell Junction, with the whole town apparently present because small towns take their celebrations seriously. Dorothy wore a dress she had made herself from blue fabric she ordered through Mrs. Aldridge, because she could sew well, and because she wanted to wear something that was hers, and she carried a bunch of early wildflowers that Thomas had gathered from the creek bank that morning, with enormous personal investment in their quality. Henry stood very straight beside his father throughout the ceremony, wearing his best shirt which someone, she suspected Mrs. Totham, had pressed within an inch of its life. When the Reverend Mac Neal asked if anyone present had objection to the union, there was a moment of absolute silence, and then Thomas said, apparently to himself but loudly enough that half the church heard it, "Good," and the church erupted in laughter. Eli looked sideways at his elder son with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and pure love, and Dorothy laughed until her eyes watered, and the Reverend, who was a practical Scotsman, waited for the church to settle and then continued the ceremony. Dorothy moved into the ranch house, and the hotel room in Caldwell Junction was returned, and her 2 trunks and her cast-iron skillet and her Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins took up residence in the house she had first entered at midnight in September of 1882. She continued teaching. She and Eli had discussed this before the wedding, both of them practical people who believed that what a person was good at and loved doing was worth keeping, and Eli arranged with the liveryman in Caldwell Junction to keep a horse there for her through the week so she did not have to ride out and back every day. She stayed in town 3 nights a week during the school term, at Mrs. Aldridge's spare room, and was at the ranch the other 4 nights, and this arrangement suited both of them because they were adults who understood that a life could hold more than one thing at once. The ranch became hers in the way a place becomes yours, gradually and then completely, through the daily accumulation of small things. She learned where the kitchen stores were kept and reorganized the flour and coffee in a way that made sense to her, and Eli did not say anything about it except to note, once, that he could now find the coffee without looking for it. She learned the names and personalities of all the horses in the barn. She learned which floorboard in the hall was loose and made a noise in the night. It was the 3rd board from the top of the stairs, and she learned to step over it, and then she learned to listen for it, because it told her when the boys were up for water or bad dreams. She learned that Eli woke before sunrise every morning and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee for half an hour before the boys got up, and she started getting up and sitting with him, and they talked or were quiet in roughly equal measure, and these half hours became, over time, the most important part of her day, the place where she knew most clearly who she was and what her life was, a kitchen at dawn with a man she loved and the sound of the planes outside the window. She learned that Henry cried in the night sometimes, not often but occasionally, quiet crying that he clearly did not want anyone to know about, and she started going to him when she heard the loose board not making a fuss, not turning on a light, just sitting on the edge of his bed and putting her hand on his back and being there. He never said anything on these occasions, but he stopped trying to be quiet about the crying after the third or fourth time, and she thought this was progress. She asked him once carefully if he wanted to talk about what made him sad at night, and he thought about it for a long time before he said, "I do not really remember her." He meant his mother. Thomas remembers a little bit. "I do not remember anything. It is like there is just a hole." "That is a hard thing," Dorothy said. "Do you mind if I think of you as mine?" he asked, with the particular formal precision of a child who has been thinking about how to say something for a long time. "I mean, I know you are Pa's wife, but I mean mine too." Dorothy sat with the weight of that question for a moment, feeling the full, honest importance of it. Then she said, "Henry, there is nothing in the world I would like more." He nodded with the same gravity he brought to everything, and went back to sleep, and Dorothy sat on the edge of his bed for a while longer in the dark, and felt something so full it was almost overwhelming. Not the romantic love she felt for Eli, which was its own entire thing, warm and certain and deep, but something more ancient and more fierce, the bone-level protectiveness that she had not known she had in her until it was aimed at a 7-year-old boy with his father's serious eyes. Thomas, who was 9 and had always been more openly expressive, simply started calling her mama approximately 6 weeks after the wedding, without ceremony or preamble. He just used the word one morning at breakfast when he asked her to pass the butter, and she passed the butter and said, "Here you go," in a normal voice, because she could tell from the way he said it that he needed her to treat it as ordinary, and she was exactly right. The summer of 1883 was good. The cattle operation had a strong season, and Eli hired 2 extra hands for the drive north men Dorothy met, and assessed with the direct practicality of a woman who knew she was sharing her ranch with them for several months. One was a quiet man named Cord who barely spoke, but did every piece of work put before him with steady skill. The other was younger, a man named Pete Delacroix who was somewhere in his middle 20s and had a talent for music that came out in the evenings when the work was done, playing a fiddle he carried in his bedroll. Pete's fiddle playing became a feature of those summer evenings. Eli and Dorothy and the boys on the porch, Cord sitting on the fence, Pete playing something with a long, low melody that floated out over the dark plains and made everything feel both transient and permanent at the same time. Thomas danced to it with the abandon of a boy who has not yet learned self-consciousness. Henry tapped his foot in precise quarter time. Eli sat beside Dorothy on the porch with his shoulder against hers and his coffee in his hands, and Dorothy leaned against him and watched the stars come out over the Oklahoma territory, and thought that this was exactly what she had meant by permanence, not the absence of change, but the presence of something real enough to weather it. She was pregnant by late summer, and she knew it with certainty by September, which made it almost exactly 1 year from the night she had driven down the Cimarron Road with a broken wagon wheel and seen a light in a window. She told Eli on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, before the boys were up, with the coffee between them and the plains just beginning to go gray with dawn. She told him plainly and directly, the way she did everything. He was very still for a moment after she said it, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and full and completely unguarded, a depth of feeling that the careful, even-keeled man she knew usually kept below the surface. "Dorothy," he said, just her name, just that. "Are you glad?" she asked, though she already knew. "I am more glad than I know how to say," he said. The boys were told over supper that evening. Thomas received the news with immediate and vocal enthusiasm. He said finally, so firmly that Dorothy looked at him surprised, and Thomas said with absolute confidence, "Me and Henry wanted you to have a baby. We talked about it. Henry said it might take a while, but it would happen." Henry, when looked at, nodded with serenity. Dorothy was not sure whether to laugh or be touched, and resolved the dilemma by doing both. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard one on the plains cold that came down from the north in November and stayed well past what was usual, with ice storms in January that kept everyone close to home and had the cattle pressed against the south fence for warmth. Dorothy, 5 and 6 and 7 months along, taught through December and then stopped teaching in January when the weather made the ride to town too uncertain. She spent January and February at the ranch, and she did not find this as confining as she had feared, because there was work enough. She helped Mrs. Totham with the cooking and preserving. She read to the boys in the long evenings. She sewed things for the baby in the lamplight, and she and Eli had more of those long kitchen table conversations that were the heartwood of their life together. She asked him once, during a long January evening, what he had thought of her when she had ridden up to his porch in the dark that September. He thought about it. "I thought you were either very brave or very reckless," he said. "And now?" she asked. "Both," he said, and the smile was full and easy now. She had that effect on him she had noticed over the months. She made him smile more easily, and he needed that because he was a man who could forget to smile if he was left to himself too long. "What did you think of me?" he asked in return. She considered. "I thought you were kind without making a production of it," she said. "I thought that was rare." He looked at her. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said to me," he said. "It is the truth," she said. He reached across and tucked a piece of hair back from her face with the back of his hand, very gently, and she leaned into the touch. And they sat in the lamplight in the kitchen of the house he had built 12 years ago, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because nothing else needed saying. The baby came in March of 1884, when the ice was breaking up and the first thin grass was showing at the edges of the creek. It was a boy, a big, loud, insistent boy who arrived in the early morning and announced himself with a vigor that Dorothy thought boded well for his eventual character. Eli was present throughout, which in 1884 was not the common practice, but was absolutely what he was going to do, and no amount of convention was going to alter it. He held Dorothy's hand through the whole thing, and Mrs. Totham managed the practical aspects with calm efficiency. And when the baby was there and crying with the full effort of his new lungs, Eli's face did the same thing it had done when Dorothy told him she was pregnant, that raw, unguarded openness, which Dorothy was beginning to understand was the man himself, the deepest version of him, the one that only came out for things of genuine magnitude. They named him James. James Crawford Blackwell, to carry both her name and his, because Dorothy had suggested it and Eli had agreed without hesitation. Thomas and Henry, introduced to their brother the following morning, had different but equally characteristic reactions. Thomas said immediately, "He is very small," with slight concern, as if he had expected better. Henry sat beside Dorothy on the bed and looked at James with the same profound assessment he had given to Dorothy herself on their first meeting, and then said, "He has Pa's chin." This observation was accurate and was delivered with a tone of approval. James Blackwell was not small for long. By summer he was a substantial, healthy infant who had strong opinions about when he was hungry and communicated them clearly, and who was passed between Mrs. Totham and both older brothers with a regularity that suggested everyone considered him community property. Thomas was a devoted older brother in the boisterous, occasionally dangerous way of boys. He wanted to teach James to do things years before James was capable of them. Henry was a devoted older brother in the quiet way. He sat beside James for long periods, simply being present, and when James was old enough to notice things, he noticed Henry first. Dorothy went back to teaching in September of 1884, when James was 6 months old, and Mrs. Totham had made it firmly clear that she was perfectly competent to manage him while Dorothy was in town. Dorothy made the arrangement work the same way she had made everything work, practically, with full attention to detail, and without the kind of guilt that would have helped no one. The years settled into a life that was full and varied and rooted in the particular richness of days that are genuinely lived rather than simply passed through. The cattle operation grew steadily under Eli's management. He was not a man who rushed or overreached, and this served the ranch well. He added a new barn in 1885 and brought in a second string of horses in 1886. The schoolhouse in Caldwell Junction got a new teacher's desk in 1885, which Dorothy considered a significant institutional improvement, and in 1886 she was given a second teacher to help with the older students, a young woman named Clara Boone from Kansas who was sharp and energetic, and who became Dorothy's closest friend in the territory. Henry Blackwell turned 11 in 1886 and presented his father with a carved oak box that he had made using every technique in his woodworking book, with dovetail joints and a lid that fit so precisely it had almost no gap. Eli held it in his large hands for a long moment, turning it over, examining the joints with his thumbnail. Then he looked at his son and said, "Henry, this is better than anything I can make." Henry received this with his characteristic solemnity, but his eyes were bright. "I know," he said, then relenting, "I had a good teacher." Eli put the box on the mantelpiece where it remained, containing important papers and small mementos for the rest of their years in the house. Thomas, at 13, was long-legged and loud and good with horses in the way that some people are born rather than taught. They seemed to understand him, which was somewhat remarkable given that he never stopped talking. He had started helping with the cattle drives in a genuine capacity, not just riding along but doing actual work, and Eli watched this development with the quiet pride of a man who is watching his child become himself. In the fall of 1886, Eli Blackwell finally extinguished the lamp in the east window, not dramatically, not with ceremony. It was an ordinary evening in October, and Dorothy was sitting in the kitchen working through her students' arithmetic papers, and Eli came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and poured himself coffee, and then he walked into the front room and trimmed the lamp in the east window all the way down until the flame went out. Dorothy heard the soft metallic sound of the lamp being handled, and she looked up from her papers toward the doorway. He came back into the kitchen and sat down across from her. "The lamp," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. His face was quiet, settled, the way it looked after hard work that has been done well and completely. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "more than all right." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I kept it burning for 6 years because I needed to. And then you came, and I kept it burning for different reasons, and those reasons were good ones." And now he stopped, looked at the kitchen around him, the table with her papers on it, the smell of the stew on the stove that Mrs. Totham had left before she retired, the sound of Henry and Thomas somewhere upstairs, the distant sound of James starting to stir from his nap in the cradle at the back of the house. "Now the whole house is lit," he said. "I do not need it in the window any more." Dorothy looked at him across the kitchen table. At this man she had been married to for 3.5 years and known for 4, and she felt the full weight of loving him. Not the easy, warm, comfortable love of a settled marriage, though it was that too, but the deeper thing, the thing that is made of knowing someone's whole history and choosing them anyway, of having been chosen in return by someone who had every reason to be closed and was instead open. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "It was a good lamp," she said. "It was," he agreed, "and it did its job." She was pregnant again by spring, which she announced at the breakfast table in April of 1887 with the same directness she had brought to the first announcement, and received the same response from all quarters. Thomas's loud enthusiasm, Henry's quiet approval, James's complete indifference because he was 2.5 and had other concerns. Eli's response was private and happened later in the kitchen before dawn, when he pulled her to him and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she felt the steady beat of his heart under her cheek and thought that this was what she had come south looking for in the fall of 1882, not just a job or a fresh start or a place to rebuild, but this exact thing, a man whose heartbeat you knew and trusted, and a house full of light. The second baby was born in October of 1887 and was a girl, and Dorothy wept when she held her for the first time, not grief, not the kind of crying she had sworn off at Thomas Crawford's grave, but something else, the kind that comes from too much goodness all at once, the overwhelming surplus of it. Eli sat beside her on the bed and did not try to stop her crying or explain it away, just put his arm around her and waited with the patience that was fundamentally his nature. They named her Rose. Rose Eliza Blackwell, the second name being Eli's suggestion, offered quietly and with a brief explanation. He wanted to close a circle with kindness rather than leave it as a wound. Dorothy agreed without hesitation, because she understood what he meant, and because she had learned that the best things Eli Blackwell did were exactly like that: quiet, thoughtful, and larger than they looked. Rose Eliza Blackwell arrived in the world with a serenity that distinguished her immediately from her brother James, who had expressed opinions loudly since birth. Rose simply looked around at everything with large, considering eyes, the way Henry did, and Dorothy recognized immediately that she had been given a daughter who would be thoughtful before she was loud, and she found this both wonderful and slightly daunting, because she was already learning that thoughtful children were more challenging in some ways, their questions going to places you were not always prepared for. Henry was 10 when Rose was born, and he took to her with an immediate and complete devotion that was somehow unsurprising. He had always been the child who attached deeply and then held. He made her a small wooden rattle within the first month of her life, perfectly smooth and sealed with linseed oil, and when she was old enough to grasp things, she held it with both hands and shook it with enormous satisfaction. And Henry watched this with an expression of professional satisfaction that made Dorothy want to laugh and hold him at the same time. Thomas, at 15, was beginning to look and sound very much like a younger version of his father, tall, broad in the shoulders, with Eli's direct gaze and quieter now than he had been, the talking having given way over the adolescent years to a more considered kind of communication. He was deeply involved in the ranch work by this point, taking real responsibility for the horse operation, and Eli treated him as a working partner with the respect that Thomas responded to, standing straighter and doing the work more carefully when it was clear that the work actually mattered. The years passed the way good years do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a fullness that makes them feel complete rather than brief. The ranch grew and the family grew within it, and Dorothy kept teaching and Eli kept ranching, and the house was always full of something: work, talk, children, the smell of food and wood smoke and leather, and the particular mixture of horse and hay that is the honest smell of a working ranch. Cord, the quiet hand, had stayed on with the Blackwells. It had been 4 years since he arrived, and he had become a fixture of the place, reliable and present. He was a modest man with a quality of stillness that the children found comforting, and James, at 3 and 4, had adopted him with the tyrannical affection of small children. Cord bore this with absolute equanimity and had been observed, on more than one occasion, carrying James on his shoulders across the yard with the expression of a man who has found this arrangement perfectly acceptable. In the spring of 1889, the Oklahoma land rush was organized, and the territory around them filled with new people almost overnight, 100,000 settlers, by some accounts, coming in on a single day to claim the unassigned lands. The character of the territory changed rapidly in the wake of it, and not always for the better. There were disputes over land boundaries, and some of the old established ranches, including 2 of Eli's neighbors, found themselves in legal trouble over claims that had been orderly before the rush and were suddenly contested. Eli navigated this period with his characteristic steadiness, making sure his own land papers were in perfect order, helping where he could with neighbors who asked for his counsel, and refusing to be drawn into the particular anger and grievance that the rush created in some of the men who had been in the territory longer and felt the sudden crowding as a violation. He acknowledged to Dorothy, in one of their kitchen before dawn conversations, that it was not entirely fair, that the territory had been taken, in the original instance, from people who had no more been consulted about that than anyone had been consulted about the rush itself, and that the history of land in this territory was not a clean history. Dorothy agreed with this fully. She had seen the effects of displacement in her teaching children, who arrived at the schoolhouse from families disrupted by the rush, confused and frightened. And she did what she had always done with disrupted and frightened children, which was to make the schoolhouse a stable and reliable place and let them find their footing. Henry turned 14 in 1889 and had developed, alongside his woodworking, an interest in engineering and construction that went beyond the bench. He had read everything the school and Mrs. Aldridge's store could provide on the subject, and Eli had ordered him books from a Kansas City catalog that arrived in a heavy package, and which Henry opened with the same careful reverence he brought to everything important. He talked, that year, about possibly going east to study properly when he was old enough. Eli listened to this with full attention and told him, when Henry had finished explaining, that if that was what he needed to do, then they would find a way to make it possible. Dorothy, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, thought that this exchange, a father hearing his son's ambition and responding not with practicality's first objection, but with "I will find a way," was one of the finest things she had witnessed in their life together. She said so to Eli later in the kitchen, and he said with his usual plainness, "He is going to be something. I'm not going to be the thing that stops him." "You are a good father," Dorothy told him. He looked at her with the directness she had come to love as one of his defining qualities. "I had good help," he said. "I could not have done this without you. I need you to know that." Dorothy looked at him, this tall, steady, careful man who had kept a lamp burning in a window for 6 years, and had let his sons believe it was for safety, and had never told anyone the real truth of it until a woman with a broken wagon wheel rode up to his porch in the dark and asked the right question. This man who had built a life out of faithfulness and hard work and a quiet, persistent capacity for love that had not diminished in the hardest years. "I know," she said. James Blackwell, who was 4 years old in 1889 and had strong views on most topics, had by this point settled into the particular personality that was going to be his for life: energetic, cheerful, with a practical intelligence that focused itself on how things worked, and a complete inability to sit still for more than 20 consecutive minutes. He was, Mrs. Totham said, the most exhausting child she had ever encountered, and she said it with such obvious affection that the insult lost all its edge. He followed Cord around the barn like a shadow when he was not following Dorothy or Eli, and he learned to ride at 3.5, and he managed it with the same natural ease Thomas had shown, though in James's case the ease came with rather more theatrics. Rose at 2 was beginning to speak with a precision that was remarkable in a 2-year-old, and she had inherited Eli's dark eyes and Dorothy's way of looking at things with careful full attention before responding. She called Henry Hen. She could not yet manage the full name, and Henry received this abbreviation with complete dignity, as if he had always been called Hen and found it entirely satisfactory. The decade turned, and the territory kept changing around them, and the ranch kept going, and the family kept growing in the ways that families do, not only in children, but in the ways people grow together over years, accumulating the shared history that is the real wealth of a life. Thomas turned 18 in the spring of 1891, taller than his father by an inch, and working the ranch as a full partner now, with the confidence of a young man who knows his work and does it well. He had begun keeping company with the eldest daughter of the Aldridge family, a young woman named Patience who had her mother's precise intelligence and her father's steadiness, and Eli observed this development with the particular expression of a father who sees something good coming and is doing his very best not to interfere with it. Dorothy, who was friends with Mrs. Aldridge and found the whole situation rather delightful, said nothing to Thomas directly, but did mention to Eli that Patience Aldridge was an excellent young woman, and Eli said he knew, and they left it at that. Henry turned 16 in 1891, and the engineering books were piling up in his room, and he had designed on paper, with careful measurements, an improved drainage system for the ranch's south pasture that was so well thought through that Eli and Cord had built it the following spring, and found it worked exactly as the drawings said it would. Henry had watched it work for the first time with the same serene satisfaction he brought to everything, and Eli had put a hand on his son's shoulder and said, quietly, "You designed that right." Henry had nodded. That was enough. Dorothy looked back on the years sometimes and thought about the strange, absolute contingency of everything. That she might have taken a different road south from Dodge City, or taken the same road on a different night, or the wagon wheel might have held for another mile before breaking. She thought about the fact that the light she had seen across the dark plain had been burning for 6 years before she ever rode toward it, kept burning by a man who was keeping faith with an absence, and that she was the person who had finally arrived to receive the light that had been burning all that time. She thought about Henry's little carved horse, still on the windowsill of their bedroom. She had moved it there from the hotel room when she moved into the ranch house, and it had stayed on the windowsill for 9 years, smooth and dark with handling. And beside it the small carved figure of the woman in the long dress with her arms slightly raised. One evening in the autumn of 1891, 9 years after Dorothy had first ridden toward the lamp in the east window, she and Eli sat on the front porch after supper while the plains went golden in the late light. The boys were around. James was in the barn doing something with purpose and noise. Rose had fallen asleep in the chair inside the door. Henry was reading. Thomas was somewhere with Patience Aldridge because he was 18, and it was autumn and the evenings were long and golden. Mrs. Totham had retired for the evening. The dogs were settled on the porch steps. It was one of those evenings that feel complete in themselves, a circle drawn by light and warmth and the comfortable presence of people who know each other all the way down. "I want to show you something," Eli said. He went inside and came back out with the lamp. Not a lamp, the same one that had stood in the east window. He set it on the porch railing in front of them and lit it, and the small orange flame rose clean and steady in the still evening air. Dorothy looked at it for a moment. "I thought you put it away," she said. "I moved it," he said, "from the window to the mantel shelf. I could not quite put it away entirely." He sat down beside her. "I want to tell you something about it that I have never told anyone." She turned to look at him. "When I lit it the first night in the fall of 1876 after Eliza left," he said slowly, "I told myself it was for her, that it was a signal, a way of saying she was welcome back. And that was true for a while." He looked at the flame. "But after the first year or two, I understood that she was not coming back, and I kept it anyway. And what I told myself after that was that it was for safety, for travelers on the road, and that was true enough that I could say it to the boys and not feel like I was lying." He paused. "But the real truth is that I kept it because I was afraid that if I let the light go out, I would stop hoping altogether. Not hoping for Eliza, I had made my peace with that, but just hoping. For anything." Dorothy was very quiet. "And then you rode up out of the dark toward it," he said, "and I thought this is what the lamp was for. Not Eliza, not safety. This." The lamp flame stood steady between them in the autumn evening, small and clear and warm, and Dorothy looked at it and then looked at him, and she felt the full, completed weight of the story they were in together. Not an accident, not just good luck, but the result of a man who had kept his lamp burning because he could not yet accept the total dark, and a woman who had been brave enough to ride toward a strange light on a stranger's property in the middle of the night. "It was for this," she agreed. He took her hand and they sat together on the porch with the lamp between them while the golden light went off the plains, and the first stars appeared and somewhere out in the dark, James Blackwell could be heard making an argument with the barn cat about something that was evidently of great mutual importance. Rose stirred inside and called out once, and then was quiet. Henry came to the door behind them, saw them sitting together by the lamp, and went back inside without a word, which was the most eloquent thing he could have done. The lamp burned on the porch railing until the wind came up and flickered it, and Eli cupped his hand around the glass chimney to steady the flame, and it steadied and kept burning. It was the spring of 1892 when Henry received the letter from the engineering school in St. Louis that told him he had been accepted as a student for the following autumn. He read the letter 3 times at the breakfast table with a stillness that communicated more than any amount of noise could have, and when he looked up, Eli and Dorothy were both watching him. "I got in," he said. "I know," Eli said. "You knew they would take me," Henry said. "I knew you would get in," Eli said. "I meant I know it is good news." He met his son's eyes across the table. "We will miss you a great deal, and we will be proud of you every day." Henry folded the letter carefully along its original creases, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and stood up and put his hand on his father's shoulder for a moment, just a moment, brief and firm, and then sat back down and finished his breakfast. Thomas and Patience Aldrich married in June of 1892, with the whole town present again, and this time it was Dorothy watching a Blackwell be married rather than being the one in the dress, and she stood beside Eli in the church and held Rose's hand on one side and James's on the other. James, at 7, had finally been persuaded to stay still for the duration of the ceremony by the promise of cake afterward. A negotiation that Dorothy considered both reasonable and indicative of her son's fundamental character, and she watched Thomas Blackwell marry Patience Aldrich with the same gap-toothed grin he had worn since he was 9 years old, and said "good" in church at his father's wedding. And she thought that the years had been very kind. Eli took her hand during the ceremony and held it for the whole thing, and she felt his thumb moving gently across her knuckles the way it did when he was thinking something he was not going to say aloud, and she leaned into his shoulder and let him think it. Henry left for St. Louis in September. Dorothy made him a traveling box of food and a new shirt, and packed his woodworking books with careful tissue wrapping. Eli walked him to the stage in Caldwell Junction, and they stood at the stage door for a moment, and Eli said something to him quietly that Dorothy, standing a few feet back, did not hear. Whatever it was, Henry nodded once with the gravity he had brought to everything important in his life, and then he embraced his father Henry, who was not given to physical expression, put his arms around Eli and held on for a moment. And Eli held his second son, and Dorothy looked at the sky above Caldwell Junction and did not attempt to contain her emotion, which she had decided, after 10 years, was not necessary. Henry leaned out the stage window as it pulled away and looked back at them. His face, for once, was not composed and grave. It was young and a little afraid and entirely itself, and Dorothy raised her hand and he raised his, and then the stage went around the curve of the road and was gone. The silence afterward was the kind that is full rather than empty. "He will do something extraordinary," Dorothy said. "Yes," Eli agreed. He stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "He will." They drove home, and the plains were golden with autumn and the sky was vast and clear, and Caldwell Junction fell away behind them and the Blackwell Ranch rose ahead, the house solid and smoke trailing and permanent on its low rise, and in the east window, because Eli had put it back, after the porch evening, after Dorothy had said it was for this, the lamp was burning. It was not burning for a woman who had left. It was not burning out of loneliness or faithfulness to an absence. It burned because this was a house where the light was always on, where there was always something burning in the window, and because a woman had ridden toward it in the dark 9 years ago and found it was meant for her, and because the man who had lit it understood now what he had always been lighting it for. Dorothy looked at it through the wagon as they drove up the road, the small steady flame in the glass, and she felt the completeness of her life, not the false completeness of a life without difficulty or loss, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having built something true. She had a husband who was her equal and her foundation. She had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, all of them growing into themselves with health and purpose, and the particular confidence of children who have been genuinely loved. She had work that mattered and a community that knew her. She had a kitchen table at dawn and a front porch at sunset, and a man's hand in hers on the wagon bench. She had ridden toward a light in the dark and found all of this. James had fallen asleep on the wagon bed behind them, sprawled with the total physical commitment of a child in deep sleep. Rose was sitting up very straight and watching the planes go by with her father's dark eyes and her mother's careful attention. Eli was driving with one hand and holding Dorothy's with the other, the way he had driven since approximately the second week of their marriage, which was how long it had taken him to decide that driving with one hand was an acceptable safety compromise given the available benefits. "Do you remember," Dorothy said, "what you told me that first morning about the lamp, that it was for travelers on the road?" "I remember," he said. "You were right," she said, "just not in the way you meant." He looked at her and the smile came full and unhurried, as it always was when it came, and he said, "No, not in the way I meant." He looked back at the road. "In a better way." The wagon pulled into the yard, and Thomas came out from the barn to take the horses. Thomas, who was a married man now and lived in the house. He and Eli had built together on the east edge of the ranch property, but who was still at the main ranch most days because that was how ranches worked. And he lifted James out of the wagon bed with the ease of a young man who has been handling horses since he was 4 and found a 7-year-old brother manageable by comparison. Eli lifted Rose down from the wagon seat, and she took his hand and walked toward the house with perfect small dignity. And Dorothy climbed down and stood for a moment looking at the ranch house in the late afternoon light, at the smoke from the chimney and the solid walls and the lamp in the east window. She thought about a night in September 1882 and a cracked wagon wheel and a long dark plane and a light. She thought about a man who had lit that light out of faithfulness and kept it burning out of hope, and who had explained it to his sons as a matter of safety, because some truths belong to their full story before they can be told properly. She thought that the story had taken the better part of a decade to tell, and it had been worth every word. She went up the porch steps and into the house and into the kitchen and put the kettle on. And when Eli came in behind her with Rose still holding his hand, and James reappeared from somewhere with hay in his hair and a look of satisfied adventure, and Thomas's voice came from outside talking to the horses in the barn with the same tone his father used, and the house filled up with the sounds and smells and warmth of all of them together. She thought that this was the whole answer to the question of why you keep a light burning when the dark is wide, and the road is long, and you cannot see who is coming. You keep it burning because someone is always coming, and because when they finally arrive, you want them to find a house full of light. The lamp burned in the east window that evening, and the evening after that, and all the evenings after that, through all the seasons that came and went on the Oklahoma plains, through the years that accumulated into the full and complete story of a life well made. It burned not for absence or hope or habit, but for the simple faithful truth that a light in the window is a good thing, and the dark is wide, and home should always be visible from the road. Eli Blackwell had kept the lamp burning for 6 years before Dorothy Crawford rode toward it, and he kept it burning for the rest of his life after, and the meaning of it changed completely between the first year and the last, and the change was her.